Today on Law Weekly, we assess how well the judiciary has fared 59 years after independence. We focus particularly on settlement of business disputes and how conducive the judiciary has made the country favorable for business investment. My guest is the former chairman of the Nigerian Bar Association's section on business law, Judge Etomi. We also have a report looking at how well the judiciary has generally fared 59 years after independence, plus our weekly recap of the top trending stories from the courtrooms. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Shola Shiedi. On October 1, 2019, Nigerians marked 59 years of independence. The occasion provided another opportunity to take stock and reflect on how well the judiciary has performed since 1960. My guest, Mr. Judge Etomi, was the pioneer chairman of the Nigerian Bar Association's section on business law. He is also a member of the Body of Benchers, the highest regulatory body of the legal profession in the country. I began the interview by asking his assessment of the judiciary 59 years after independence, especially from a business law and dispute perspective.
59 years is long enough for us to assess whether or not we, through the judicial system, we can actually classify ourselves as a country worthy of investments. Now, when I started out practice so many years ago, business law disputes were expeditiously dealt with. We can argue that the caseload was much lower, but it was very rare to have business law disputes go on for up to 2 years. In fact, people would generally scream. And it was also directly proportionate to the response of investors. And so we saw quite a high level of investment flow because there was certainty about how disputes will end up. But unfortunately, a mixture of an explosion in the economy, explosion in the population, which has directly impacted workload in the courts, has seen our courts struggling to cope with business law disputes. And this is exacerbated by the advent of what you might call party politics. The good news perhaps is that you are beginning to get alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, and people are becoming more and more conscious of them. So ADR, it comes in different forms: mediation, arbitration, and so forth. But again, this sad spectacle with those ones is that disputes, especially on points of law, still go from those panels to the courts, where they can then, you get another round of delays. Even our special courts like the IST, the Investment and Securities Tribunal, they're not faring better. So we need a holistic view about what our justice delivery system is designed to achieve from a business law perspective. And I think it's important that the NBA works with the judiciary to create a template that enables disputes surrounding businesses to be dealt with expeditiously. Some have advocated for constitutional or election special courts to separate them, so that you separate them, and then business law decisions. They should actually, next perhaps to criminal law, they should perhaps be given precedence. We need more and more experts. That's another problem we have. Many of our judges are still what I call jack of all trade. We should begin to look at crimes where there are special divisions that are created for business law disputes. It is not an accident that many businesses choose arbitration venue to be outside of this country, even when Nigerian law is the governing law in many of these contracts. And that's a little bit of a slap on us. And when you ask them, even Nigerian businessmen, and the question is simple: why should I spend 5 years to know my fate when in 3 months, in 6 months, I can know the same fate, because it's on that climb. So it goes to planning. Businesses plan. And if they cannot include in their planning expeditious resolution of disputes, it's a huge deterrent to investment.
So you've talked about the problems with the judiciary, the delays with the court system and all of that. What other things do you consider as threats to the economy, and what do you think that the government should focus on going forward, especially 59 years after independence?
Again, I'm glad you asked this, because at times people wonder what's the link between things that go on in the economy and the attraction for investments. The truth is that they're all linked. We're now talking about how the judiciary itself can contribute to speedy resolution of matters as their own way of getting businesses to find this environment favorable. But to do that, the environment itself must be favorable to businesses. And today, many experts will tell you, 59 years after, we are grappling with some of the most basic things. Cost of governance and cost of doing business is still very high compared to so many other countries that we're competing with. Our infrastructure is generally still in a very bad place. And infrastructure includes, in my opinion, the court system as well, because we're still discussing whether or not the judiciary should be independent, how much we should give to them, if they can spend their money. If you take the sum total of all of these, you find that they threaten a boom, the boom we expect in businesses. And I know that there have been so many fora where Nigeria 59 has been discussed. And one thing that was a common thread to all of them is that we still are a sleeping giant. An emphasis is sleeping, and emphasis is also on giant, which means the potential exists. And I think the frustration for many one of us is, for how long should this giant remain sleeping? Let's look at some specific threats. Many people will tell you expenditure is very high. A high proportion of our expenditure goes into subsidies. We're subsidizing petroleum, we're subsidizing power, we're subsidizing so many other things. Now, simple question. Nothing wrong with subsidy, but I think the quarrel here is that the way we're doing it is inefficient. Instead of subsidizing petroleum products, for example, why don't you use that money, 1 or 2 trillion naira, as they say, and invest it heavily in road and rail transportation? Because it is people that bring about development. The ability for people to move from place to place easily, that brings about development through the history of mankind. The countries that develop means of transportation, be it sea, air, whatever, are some of the most prosperous today. So you can't run away from it. But today is a nightmare to even transport goods from Lagos to Ibadan, from Port Harcourt to Owerri, and all that. There are huge agricultural products in the north. By the time they come in these slow wagons to the south, most of them have perished. So the roads, the railways, power is another area where the subsidy there is inefficient. You don't want cost-reflective tariffs. And I ask the question, so who are you doing this for? The average Nigerian, who because of the epileptic nature of power supply, still needs to self-generate. He buys a generator, he buys diesel, by the time you look at the sum total of what it costs him to give himself power, is far higher than what a cost-reflective tariff will give him. And he knows that he can go to sleep. No generator noise, no health hazard, so many different things. So what we need to do going forward is to really look at how we can begin to reprioritize our subsidies such that it works.
I want to take you back to something that you talked about earlier, our attitude to disputes. And that brings me to the question of the way that the country is handling the P&ID disputes. What do you make of the way that we're handling it? And how do you think that the country can better handle it going forward?
The P&ID matter is a very sorry matter. And I say sorry because if you read the intention behind it, at least if we go by the reports we got, those who originally conceived of it thought that if they could harness gas that had been flared, they could get a cheap source of gas to power our generating plants. And they were thinking as much as 2,000 megawatts. Today that me and you now know about power. 10 years ago when it was conceived, nobody knew about power. Today, as a nation, we're struggling with 4,000 megawatts. These people were talking about 2,000. That means half our supply today would have been coming relatively cheaply and therefore can impact on the price of electricity. So that was the thought behind it. Altruistic, no-brainer. But then when you go into the details of the execution, you then begin to wonder, as some people are wondering, wasn't this thing structured to fail from the beginning? If you were going to do such a laudable project, and the main ingredient for it, the gas, has not been secured, can we not begin to wonder why you didn't do so? We had ADAX, Mobil were spoken to, but they were not parties to the contract. And when they just thought we were jokers, they pulled out. And the moment they pulled out, we had no ability to keep our own end of the bargain. And this is why I don't blame those who are saying that this thing was structured to fail. And and you're beginning to wonder what other contracts are in the system that are structured to fail like that. So that's one bucket. And that's sad, because if true enough, the motives were altruistic, it's so sad that execution has now made it look like it was structured to fail from the very beginning. Then there is then the deal about, all right, it finally ends up in a dispute. How do you then handle the dispute? It comes back to the point I was making. First of all, dispute resolution, Nigerian law, but venue, London, just what we are saying. So that means even the most patriotic of people know that you'll be hard put to get justice here, which as a lawyer I'm sad to hear about. So everybody runs to London. You get two arbitrators, a Nigerian an arbitrator, a foreign arbitrator, the two of them elect to get a third arbitrator. So 2 against 1, and I'm not surprised by the way the ruling went, because the Nigerian arbitrator will understand the circumstances here. And I think what really piques everyone is that how do you get to a point where people who have not invested, as we see today, in anything are now awarded damages for even profits that nobody could guarantee they could have made, because that judgment assumed that they would make. How many times have we run businesses with assumptions that don't happen? All manner of things can happen. But strict interpretation of the law, if that's what you signed, then you must learn to live by it. Then there's a third bucket, which is now the point we're alleging, fraud. Of course, fraud vitiates any contract. The only sad thing is I wonder why this wasn't raised during the arbitration, because it's a very potent point. If you are now beginning to unravel things that point in the direction of fraud, then nobody should benefit from a fraudulent act. But fraud, the standard of proof in fraud is very high. So I'm hoping that we have unassailable evidence to push that through. But in doing that, I always advocate you must always have alternative plans to these things. There is absolutely nothing in this world that cannot be negotiated. Even judgment debts are negotiated. So when we are pushing for all these things, all or nothing may not work entirely. We should open channels for negotiations, because in a sense there's a price to pay, even if it's a price for unpatriotism on the part of the Nigerians that are involved, because you cannot exonerate yourself from blame. We see that in so many government agencies. For me personally, the lesson this thing teaches me is that the less government gets involved in business, the better for every one of us, because governance is not structured for it. Today we have a president who is known for his integrity, who has come on the platform of fighting corruption, who is the next president who may not share these values and who would wield enough powers to do one thing or the other. That is the only problem that I have with government in business. So one of the lessons we should take away, apart from the recommendations I'm making, is that government should really, as a principle, begin to get hands off business and begin to take care of the regulatory environment in which businesses thrive.